I wanted to show you a couple clips of Erickson working with somebody and just point out to you some of the patterns he's using and why he's using them. Okay, clip 1.
This time, I'd like to have you take your time about going into a trance. I don't want you to go into a trance too soon. And you know how easy it is for you.
What Erickson said is he looks over at Mondi and he says, well, Mondi, this time, I'd like you to take your time about going into a trance. You know how easy it is for you. He's presupposing something. Trance is going to happen. He's directing her attention away from whether or not hypnosis is going to happen, and he's directing her towards take her time about it, right? So that's one thing that's happening with that presupposition. By adding this time, I'd like you to take your time about going into a trance. But also notice that when Erickson adds the word this time to that statement, that also presupposes that they've done this before, right? So if I say, hey, this time I'd like you to do it this way. Well, that presupposes that you've done this before, right? So Erickson is indirectly getting Mondi to associate into the past, into the last time they did this, which happened to be a time when she went very quickly. You know, one of Erickson's more formal inductions, it's called accessing a previous trance state. And he would simply have a person walk through the last time they went into hypnosis. And naturalistic technique, it would revivify the previous trance in the present moment. So he's not doing that here with Mondi. What he's doing is more subtle. Because in order for Mondi to make sense of what Erickson means about taking her time about it this time, she has to think about last time as a means of comparison. So subliminally reminding her of the last time. And he's also using a mind reading pattern. I know how easy it is for you. He's also doing almost like a reverse psychology. So Erickson had a way of dealing with resistance. He recognized that resistance is a natural thing, especially during inductions. Resistance happens in ways that people aren't even conscious of. Perhaps the person's arm doesn't lift up. Perhaps there's a long delay in the person responding. Perhaps the person abreacts. Erickson felt that resistance was natural. It was a way in which the person was expressing their personal autonomy and pushing back a little bit, if subliminally. So whether they're conscious of it or not, they will find ways to resist or push back. So Erickson thought it was important to give the person something to resist, but something relatively minor to push back against that will discharge the resistance. Does anybody know which principle this would be an example of that I'm talking about right now? So this would be a way of being strategic, right? So he would give somebody something minor to rebel against as a way of discharging the resistance. In this situation, he's sharing with Mondi that his preference is for her to take her time, to go slowly. If Mondi decides to push back, well, that's the thing that she's going to resist. Because of his use of presupposition, his artful use of presupposition, if she does express resistance, it's not going to be to the prospect of the hypnosis happening at all. It's going to be to Erickson's preference for her to take her time about it. And so here's the interesting trick. What happens if you resist taking your time about it? Well, then she'll just go more quickly into it. So I've watched this many times, and I'm not really sure if Erickson really wants her to take her time about it, or if he's just setting her up in way of like reverse psychology. Because there's a couple of other times where he says things like, don't go too fast, Mondi. You know how easy it is for you. Whoa, slow down, Mondi. And so in some way, he's actually trying to get her to go quickly into hypnosis, but he's being paradoxical about it as a way of dealing with any potential resistance. Okay, so the next thing that happens, Erickson breaks with Mondi. He looks over at Nick. Nick is a friend of Mondi's who's Erickson decided to include in this experience. And Nick has no experience with hypnosis. So we'll play clip 2 now.
And while Nick is here, I'd like to have you watch Mondi's face. And your unconscious mind will learn a great deal. So turn and look so you can see her.
Okay, so he looks over at Nick and he says, and while Nick is here, to Nick, I'd like you to watch how Mondi's face. So talk about artfully vague, right? Watch how Mondi's face what? Right? He leaves that like an ellipsis, dot, dot, dot. Watch how Mondi's face, and your unconscious mind will learn a great deal. So turn and look at her. Turn and look so you can see her. So one thing I think is happening there is that Nick has no experience with hypnosis. So he wants Nick to actually watch Mondi. Think about this concept of mirror neurons, right, that I mentioned earlier today. Just by watching somebody go into a trance, you have these brain cells that will start to resonate with what you perceive that person to be experiencing. So Erickson knows Nick has no experience with hypnosis, so he has no model for it. So if he watches Mondi, Mondi will provide a visual model for him that his own unconscious or mirror neurons will start to resonate with. When he says your unconscious will learn a great deal, well, that's what he means. He means that his mirror neurons, his his limbic system, all that will start to resonate and use Mondi as a guide for his own trance. And that's also why I think Erickson doesn't complete the statement when he says, watch how Mondi's face. Well, watch how Mondi's face what? We talked about response readiness and sensitivity to minimal cues. He wants Nick to look at Mondi expectantly. If he tells him what to look for, that might take away some of the ambiguity, and that would heighten the impact of not knowing specifically what to look for, just sorting for any change in her face. Also keep in mind that Erickson is aware that Mondi can hear him. So remember, we talk about shifting the referential index sometimes to be more indirect. So sometimes instead of telling you to take a deep breath and close your eyes, I might talk about what other people do. Most people find that when they close their eyes, I shift who I'm referring to. Well, in some ways, Erickson is doing that. He's telling Nick something's going to happen to Mondi's face. And so Mondi is picking up on that as well. And so in other words, he's giving Mondi an indirect suggestion. And okay, so let's we'll go to 3 and then we'll wrap it up. So clip 3.
Not quite that fast, Mondi. Let's have a little talk first. Because in the trance, I will want you to do something of importance for you. And just for you. I'm just waiting. And you know why I'm waiting for? That's right. That's right. Always shut up. And go deeply into trance so that your unconscious can deal with that vast store of memories that you have. It is as if you're traveling a highway passing this scene, that scene in your life, and perhaps something very nice that you could recall that you haven't thought about for years.
Okay, so if you remember, after Erickson finishes with Nick, he says to Nick, watch how Monty's face, turn so you can look, so you can see her. Then he breaks with Nick, looks back to Mondi, and he says, not so fast, Mondi. Because Mondi, her eyes were starting to close. So he says, let's have a little talk first. He says, because in the trance, I will want you to do something of importance for you, and just for you. And so notice, again, artfully vague, right? Remember some of the patterns like unspecified verbs and so on, and deletion as a filter. I will want you to do something of importance for you, and just for you, ... What he was trying to do with her there was he wanted Mondi to be able to feel like she could have a private moment for herself, because there was a studio audience and Nick was there and Erickson's there. And so by saying to her, I'd like you to do something of importance and just for you. But I just want you to notice those words, right? Something of importance. Well, what specifically? Well, that's going to create, remember that term transderivational search? That's something of importance. That's going to make her go inward and just for you. So she can think of something important that's just for her, something private. And then he just says, and just waiting. Again, artfully vague, waiting for what? Waiting for what? And then he says it again, and just waiting. And he looks at her. He says, and you know what I'm waiting for. And then at that moment, guess what happens? Erickson planted a seed a little earlier, remember? He said, watch how Mondi's face. And then he says, and just waiting. So now back to the seed, right? And what happens? Mondi's face changes. Her eyes close, her facial muscles relax, and all the way down, right? So in that example, there's a few different things going on there, right? I mean, the seeding, watch how, he's telling Nick, watch how Mondi's face. Goes back, talks to Mondi about a few other things, and then says, and just waiting. And she picked up on it, that her face would change, that she would go into, as she went into an altered state, into a trance. But what I really love about that part of the clip is, talk about the indirect approach, right? Not only is Erickson incredibly artfully vague, and it's artful in the sense that it almost doesn't sound like he's being vague at first. Like it almost sounds like he's being very specific, like the way he uses predicates and prepositions and words like this and that. But you'll notice that there's a lot of words missing, something of importance. What I'm getting at is that the most powerful thing I think there, of the most powerful demonstration of the indirect approach is precisely that he just says, he plants some seeds over here indirectly. Mondi's face, watch on Mondi's face. Goes back, doesn't even say anything to Mondi. Just said, I'm just waiting, expectantly, just waiting. And then the suggestion actualizes itself. Like I've been talking about all day, but indirection, that, you plant these seeds, these evocative seeds, and then a naturalistic thing happens where the person responds in an avolitional, idiodynamic, or automatic way. It's a naturalistic response. And to me, that's a powerful demonstration of the indirect approach, of indirection. First, looking over here to plant a seed over here, creating some separation between Mondi and Nick, and the seed that he planted by getting her to focus on something of importance that's private for her. And then going back to, and just waiting, which is, in other words, in parentheses, waiting for you to actualize the change in your face that indicates that you're going into trance, and you going into trance. And then after that, I won't go over all of it, but there's just a lot of beautiful language that he uses there. You know, he says, talks about surveying that vast storehouse of unconscious wisdom and memories. He talks about her memories can become like a highway, and she can drive down the highway of her life. And he's using metaphor. And he's trying to evoke when she saw the world as a child, as sort of a child's mind. He talks about something like, you know, when first you saw the world as a child looking up as you were crawling, and then at one point you saw the world the way it looked when you stand up, trying to evoke early memories when she felt a sense of wonder and, you know, and openness to things. That's utilization. And he's trying to evoke these early memories as resources that later on throughout the session, he'll then use those states that he's evoked in her to help her with things that she's wanting to change now. Essentially, getting her to reframe current things in her life by first evoking pleasant childhood memories and using that as a resource.